At some point in a chess game, you'll find yourself out of known theory and having to think for yourself. Now, this can be quite a difficult task if you don't have the right toolkit, but in this video, I'm here to give you 3 questions that you can ask yourself at any point in the chess game, which should give you sufficient ideas to come up with what will be a good plan for the next couple of moves, or even sometimes enough to finish the game. The first question I want you guys to ask is which of my pieces can be improved? And in this position, I think it should be quite clear that it is in fact the king that hasn't moved enough. Now, this also goes in terms with the principle that you want to try and activate your king in the endgame. And as we can see here, most of the pieces have been traded off. There's just bishops and rooks on the board, so the king can be activated fairly confidently. So I began to move my king into the position to guard this center d6 pawn. I'm not bothered by this exchange of bishops, as that would give me 2 center pawns and the open c-file to work with my rook. So I just continued to guard my pawns, which are weak pawns, but at the same time it's quite hard to exploit. And eventually I slowly moved my king over to defend the weaknesses so that I could liberate my rook and focus on trying to improve that piece as well. So I continue to move my king over. My king now guards these 2 pawns very nicely, and I can try and improve my rook's placement. I exchange the bishops and continue to improve my rook. So you can see that this entire game so far has just, this endgame has been played just with the sole focus of trying to activate and improve pieces. I improved my king's placement to defend the weaknesses. Now I'm improving my rook's placement, trying to attack my opponent's weaknesses. I continue to improve the rook, provoking this pawn movement. This pawn is provoked forward, and finally my opponent cracks. My rook has fully optimized over to the corner of the board and is now ready to start pressuring this pawn. My opponent guards it, but I deliver this check, and all of these weak pawns over here collapse. I just clean up, and nice and straightforward, stopping the enemy plan with this move king c7, preventing any infiltration, and my opponent resigns shortly after because my rook is just going to collect another pawn. So in this example, we are looking for what the weakness in our opponent's camp is. This is the second essential question that you have to ask. I've already improved a couple of my pieces, but at the same time, improving pieces and attacking weaknesses can often go hand in hand. So we should be able to identify that this e6 square is a huge weakness for black. There are no pieces defending it, and we can actually get to it in just 2 moves with the knight here very nicely. So knight to f3 and knight to g5 looks like a very clear plan. It's what I go for. And noticing that h6 looks like a plan to stop the knight, but actually it doesn't work. I go in with the knight anyway, and after my opponent tries to capture this pawn here, exploiting a pin, I evaluated it as not a big deal. I just sidestep out of the way with my king, saying that now your knight is properly hanging, and after they move their other knight in, trying to get aggressive and attack my queen, I just drop my queen back, maintaining the pin, attacking this pawn here, and now their knight is also hanging. So their plan wasn't successful, and I got to the weakness. They decided to resign the game. Okay, moving on to the next example of spotting weaknesses here. My opponent just played the move pawn to a5, and the question is, why is this such a mistake? Now, the reason is because we can actually create a weakness in the position with the move pawn to a3. Now, the idea of this move is that after the trade of these pawns here, this a5 pawn will become a weak pawn. And that's exactly what happens. We exchange off the pawns, the a5 pawn is now weak, and the new plan is very straightforward. I just want to double up my rooks, capture the pawn, and then try and promote this b pawn here, and it's that simple. We can also put promoting pawns under the blanket idea of improving your pieces, because your pawns get much better as they push down the board, as they have the potential to promote into a queen. My opponent moved their knight in, I stacked up, took the knight, claimed the pawn, and they tried to castle. Now, I thought castling was probably quite a good idea, so I gave them a check, trying to stop them, and offered an exchange of queens. And my reasoning here was that after the queens were to come off, I had identified this other weak pawn here on d6, and saw that if they were to castle, I can move my knight in and try to capture this pawn. They moved their queen back, I delivered a check, and now I've improved my pawn, which is now looking to become a queen. They castled, I started improving the placement of my knight so that it can escort this pawn into becoming a queen. They moved out their bishop. I decided not to trade rooks because I thought my rook was better than their rook, and I can gain a tempo on the bishop and then move my knight into the game. Firstly, I moved the pawn slightly closer because I'm threatening to go bishop to b7. This is concrete. They moved the rook, and now my knight goes in to guard the pawn. I'm just moving the rook to overprotect here, and then knight goes to d6. This is the weak square that we were talking about earlier on. Same weak square, doesn't have a pawn on it, but it doesn't matter because now we are promoting. The game ended shortly after. Okay, now in this game, we're going to be looking at identifying the opponent's plans and whether or not they're any good. After my opponent took this pawn and I moved my rook here, they played queen c2, expecting that if I were to take this pawn, then they can deliver a check and capture my rook. Now what you have to evaluate is whether or not this is actually a good idea. Now in the game, I evaluated that it was not a good idea for them to get greedy and take this rook because of concrete calculations that there was in fact a checkmate. Now, this question of trying to evaluate your opponent's ideas is often quite concrete, but it's fairly straightforward, this example, I think, because it's literally just looking for checks and checkmates. And oftentimes your opponent's ideas won't be crazily complicated and you will be able to find them. You just have to try and think what it is that they're going for. You have to try and put yourself in their shoes and come up with what you think would be a good idea initially, and then try and prove yourself wrong. In chess, you're always trying to prove yourself wrong and come up with the best ideas for the opponent. You're not trying to put the bad ideas in your opponent's mouth, but in this case, there really isn't a whole lot better after the rook takes the pawn than this idea of going for the rook. The game is pretty much over. Finally, we're going to look at one more idea, which is my opponent clearly wanted to go pawn to b4 in this game and then plant their knight in the center. That's why they played bishop to f6, because they wanted extra support of this d4 square so that they can put their knight there. So I actually didn't think this was a good idea, so I played a4 to provoke b4, put my knight in the center, going for this exchange, and wanted to provoke them to put their knight in the middle. Now, the reason I had evaluated this plan as not good for black is not because I was going to take the knight, but because of pawn to c3, which looks like it does trap the pony, but the pony can escape to b3, although from which I can attack it and it becomes really sidelined. And then I saw this idea of improving my queen and attacking enemy weaknesses with this move queen to d3. I centralize the queen, putting it in the middle, and also attack this weak a6 pawn. There isn't really a good way to defend it. If you move your rook to the side, then tactics bishop to b6 attacks the queen and the knight. They exchange pieces, move their queen over to c8, and I play this nice move, rook to d6, simply attacking the weaknesses yet again. This d6 pawn, you'll notice, can often become very weak in certain structures, like the Sicilian Najdorf. And as you can see, I'm attacking these two pawns. My opponent, very dejected, played bishop to d8 and resigned the game on the same move as all of their pawns are dropping off the board. So I really hope that you guys let this sink in. I'm just going to go quick summary, get the notes up. The 3 questions you need to ask. Which of my pieces can be improved? Also, how long will it take to improve them? Do I have time to do that? What are my opponent's weaknesses and how can I attack them? So often, which of my pieces can be improved and what are the opponent weaknesses go hand in hand together. You want to improve your pieces by looking to attack enemy weaknesses with those pieces. And then finally, trying to evaluate what your opponent's plans are. Now, and the reason for that is because if you know what they're going to do, you can decide whether or not it's worthwhile trying to stop it, Or potentially, if you don't think it's a very good plan, you've evaluated better than them, you can decide whether or not you can allow their plan to happen and let them self-destruct. Now, what you will notice looking at these three questions is that two of them are actually focused on what the enemy, what the opponent is trying to do. Now, I think that's really interesting because chess at its core is not a self-centered game. You really have to pay attention to what the opponent is doing so that you can adapt and overcome what their plans and ideas will be. At the end of the day, most of the plans you're going to come up with, you could even play a very nice game of chess simply by stopping everything that the opponent wants to do that is good and allowing them to do things which are bad for them. Top players like Karpov used to have this style, which was extremely annoying to play against. But anyway, if you guys did enjoy this video, please do consider liking and subscribing, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.